Hi, it's Dr. Mark Westner, and welcome to week number 5. Our topic is the Gospels and the parables. The parables obviously are within the Gospels, so we're spending our time on Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John this week, and what they teach us about Jesus, how they go about teaching the reader about Jesus, and the keys to understanding them, both theologically, which is important to the Gospels, and also in terms of literature, which has been the focus of the course the whole time. Now, first of all, I guess it's important to say what the Gospels aren't. They're not primarily biographies or histories or documentaries. I mean, they certainly contain those elements, but that's not their primary purpose. What they are the 4 different authors' attempts to show Jesus as God's complete solution to the human predicament. And that'll make more sense as we go through the Gospels, but they're very intentional. They each have a purpose, and they want to show why Jesus came, who Jesus is, and how he fulfills God's expectations in terms of solving the human predicament. And that's the goal of each one of those. Each has their own style, and you notice that, especially for Mark, for example, you'll notice that everything is really quick. Mark uses the word immediately lots. This happened, and then that happened, and immediately this happened, and you get this fast-paced action. John, for example, is almost on the other end, where an event will happen, and he'll give you all kinds of thoughts and observations behind the text. So it's kind of a behind-the-scenes look in some ways as the Gospel of John. They each have their own style. Now, just to get going, a couple of principles is to reading them is there's something called the synoptic Gospels, and that's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And the reason they're called synoptic is because they have a lot of the same material. So you'll maybe read the same parable or the same teaching of Jesus. It'll happen in 2 or 3 of them. And then John is just called the Gospel of John because a lot of the content in there isn't similar to Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And as you read the textbook, you'll see different theories about, well, who was written first? Was it Matthew or was it Mark? Did Matthew draw from Mark and Luke drew from that? Or who contributed to which author and when and how and all that kind of thing. There's different theories about that. The important thing for us is just to know that there is some interdependence. We're not totally clear what it is, but for our purposes, we're going to take each gospel on its own terms and read it in its entirety and see what Mark has to say, see what Matthew has to say, rather than trying to put them together and recreate some synthetic history. 2 quick guidelines. Number 1, when you read a story in the Gospels, read it as an individual story. Let it stand on its own terms. So if you're reading, say, the parable of the prodigal son or Jesus teaching on the Sermon on the Mount, read those. Read the whole thing. Let them stand and assume they have some sort of literary integrity. But the second part is they're also part of the Gospel. So if you're doing the Sermon on the Mount, read all of Matthew. See how it fits into Matthew's themes and what he's trying to get at. That's a pretty important thing. In terms of the purpose of each of the Gospels, again, these are general statements, but as a kind of a guideline to see the intent, Matthew's purpose is to show Jesus as the long-awaited Messiah. So there's lots of connection with the Old Testament and how things work. Mark is fascinating because his whole point is to get the reader to ask the question, well, who is Jesus? And so you actually see a lot of questions being asked in Mark, either by Jesus or people talking with Jesus, that type of thing. Luke's point is to say, you know what, if you believe in Jesus, here's some really good reasons of why you can have confidence in that. Who is Jesus? It's okay to believe in him. Here's some rationale for doing that. So it's more of a methodical type of writing. And then fourth, John takes on a huge challenge, and he's trying to show that Jesus is both fully divine and fully human at the same time, which explains why there's a lot of deeper thinking in John, that type of thing. Now, one of the keys to understanding the Gospels, the whole New Testament actually, is this concept of the kingdom of God. It's one of the few times in this course where we're going to kind of take a break and go into theology as opposed to just looking at the literature of the Bible. But we need to wrap our heads around that if we're going to understand the Gospels and the rest of the New Testament. The kingdom of God is a complex subject. People have written books and books and books just on that. I'm going to try to summarize it really quickly. But in the first century, most Jews were thinking they were living on the end of time, the edge of time. History was about to end, and God was going to usher in his kingdom where everything, all the wrongs were made right. All the sickness was gone, the wickedness was gone, and it was replaced with wholeness and completeness. Shalom is often a word that's used to describe that. So the Jews were expecting that. Jesus walks onto the scene, fulfills all kinds of messianic prophecies, and people think, this is it. This is who he is. And if you think about Palm Sunday in the Gospels, Jesus rides into the holy city of Jerusalem. People are proclaiming him as king and all kinds of amazing statements because they're saying this is finally it. But then within a few short days, he's hung on the cross and he dies. And their world comes crashing down, because if that was the Messiah, how did this just happen? It's almost like this roller coaster ride of all the way up and then boom, all the way down. Well, the kingdom of God overlaps that. The kingdom of God, and that concept, depending on how the different authors of the New Testament use it, talk about God's role, or God starting to bring deliverance and wholeness and completeness to the earth. And you see that in Jesus' miracles. He heals people, he delivers people from demons. His followers start to do that. So it starts to happen, but it's not totally complete. When Jesus goes back, his disciples still struggle with fulfilling his mission, and sometimes they're successful, sometimes they're not. And then the early church is kind of locked in this battle of, well, we know that Jesus, who he says he is, we know that God has given, is more powerful, but it's not always realized. There's this struggle and this war. How does it always work spiritually? And it's this tension of in between. Now, one scholar, Gordon Fee, has come up with the phrase, and he says, the kingdom of God is already, but not yet. And I think that's a brilliant way of describing it. The kingdom of God for a Christian is already here. Jesus has come, deliverance has started, but it's not yet complete. So for the New Testament Christians, and anybody who's claimed to be a Christian since, is living in that tension in between, that already but not yet time, where the kingdom is kind of here, but it's not totally here. That mindset, or that picture, is key to understanding the Gospels, and actually the rest of the New Testament, all of the books. Now, if we focus down from the Gospels and talk about parables, a couple quick things. Number one, parables are just some short stories that Jesus told at different points in different Gospels, trying to make different points when he's talking to people. They're the self-contained little units. And what some people think they are is they're illustrations of Jesus' sermons elsewhere, but that's not actually right. The parables are meant to stand on their own. They don't need necessarily words around them to explain them. The parable themselves are the message. And the keys to understanding them are the points of reference and the audience, and I'll explain those in a second. But first, just to wrap your head around what a parable is, they're kind of, in some ways, like modern jokes. If I were to say, a priest, a rabbi, and a nun walked into a bar, well, right away you're expecting me to tell a joke, and you know it's going to involve those three characters, and two of them are going to do the predictable thing, one of them is going to do something unpredictable, and that's going to be the punchline. All I had to do was start saying that bit of a phrase, you know, a priest, a rabbi, and a nun, and you knew where it was going, you knew what to expect. The parables were the same thing back then. Well, there was a man from Jericho who did, well, as soon as Jesus launches into one of those scenarios, all the people back there know what he's doing. They know he's telling a parable, they know it's a self-contained unit, and they get it, which is why you see such strong reactions to Jesus' parables sometimes, because they get it all too well. The problem, though, is the context of Jesus and the context of us is not the same. It's separated by thousands of years, different cultures, that type of thing. So two of the tricks to understanding the parables today is just trying to figure out the points of reference. Who are the characters that are being talked about? What was a priest or a scribe, or when it talks about a father running to meet somebody in some of Jesus' parables? What does that mean? What's the significance of a father running? And so those are the points of reference that we can connect to. And then the second part is the audience. Who is Jesus talking to? Was he talking to Jewish leaders? Well, then the parable probably had something to do with the Jewish leaders. Was he talking to the disciples? Well, then it probably had something to do with the disciples. That type of thing. Now, that's not necessarily hard, because 9 times out of 10 the Gospels themselves say right in that passage Jesus was talking to the disciples, or he replied to the Pharisees, so that gives us a clue. So that's a really, really good tip-off to how to understand those. So the Gospels, the parables, they're all tied in together. They're all about Jesus, the kingdom of God. They're all intentional, and the best way to read it is to read the whole Gospel of Mark or the whole Gospel of Luke. Get the big picture and then try to understand the little ones, little pictures in the middle. So I hope that helps you, and I hope you're enjoying this class. Thanks.